Good morning, everybody. This is Father Javier. Welcome to this Sunday's Adult Formation Program, the last for our season of Lent. I am excited today in our Lenten series to welcome once again a face you'll recognize, Rabbi Ariel Edery from Beth Shalom, as we talk about the liturgical year. What that looks like in the Jewish tradition, what that looks like in the Christian tradition, and how they relate to one another. I think it should be a fun conversation we'll have today. Just a few housekeeping notes as usual today. If you're joining us for the first time, remember that you are always welcome to submit questions to the Q&A. It should be a button at the bottom of your screen or at the top, depending on what kind of device you're using. Or you can submit questions in the chat. If you'd like to have a conversation in the chat, just make sure to click send message to attendees and panelists so other folks can participate in the conversation as well. So what we'll do today, as we've done the last couple of times, is Rabbi Ariel will spend some time sharing with us a little bit about the Jewish tradition in relation to the liturgical year. And as Rabbi Ariel and I did during our deep dive sessions, we figured we'd have a little bit of conversation toward the end of that time and still leave 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So as I mentioned earlier, just submit your questions to the Q&A. You'll be able to raise your hand and speak up if you'd like at the end. So we'll save that for the end, but in the meantime, enjoy and participate in this conversation as we get started. So welcome, Rabbi. How are you today?
Good. How are you, Javier?
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
So it's really a pleasure to be here and be here again with the people of St. Paul. You know, here. Next time we'll be there. And I always enjoy, I hope everybody at St. Paul, you enjoy Father Javier. I enjoy every opportunity I have to chat and talk to you. So it's wonderful to be here too.
The feeling is mutual. So I'm just glad you're here with us today.
So I am actually right now looking at the window. It seems like a beautiful sunny day is coming, and I see lots of birds showing up that they weren't showing up a month ago, and I see some plants beginning to spring, and it seems that these creatures know that there's a new season. So I wanted to speak a little bit today about, you know, when we talk about the liturgical calendar, and I get the feeling, because that's been my experience growing up in a religious community, right? We celebrate holidays, and we celebrate all holidays that somehow are connected to the Bible and that somehow are a religious event. And if I'm in a synagogue celebrating any holiday, it's hard for me to think that this has anything to do with the trees outside. And so the first thing I wanted for us to keep in mind is that before there was any of our religions, cycles existed, the seasons existed. And when we, just like the creatures out there, depended so much on what grows outside to survive and to eat, and we better be prepared for the winter or we'll freeze to death. So we are, as humans, always very, very attuned to the seasons. And we know winter will be a scary season. Some of us may not survive the winter, and you better prepare, you know, 3 months with nothing growing, no food, right? And spring seems like, oh, what a gift. After a long winter, we made another one. Time to get ready, time to prepare, time to enjoy, time to work. So when it comes to the Jewish tradition, it's very important, and the biblical tradition, it's essential that we keep in mind those seasons and natural cycles, because what I would like to share with you today is how those holidays that supposedly have no much of a connection to anything other than history or a religious principle. Actually, they're all put together with these natural cycles, and it might be actually where they started from. So one quick reference to that will be, well, I just mentioned spring. In a couple of weeks, in about 8 days, I'm going to be celebrating Passover, right? We are in Lent period now, right? So this is it. We have these things. And of course, neither Easter or Passover, the Exodus and all that had to do with spring. But we do celebrate it exactly every spring, right? In fact, attuned to the moon, right? The first moon in spring and all that. So I would say that even before there was an Exodus and even before there was a Passion story, people will mark this time. Spring was an important moment and people will gather and do whatever it is. Sometimes they may praise their fertility goddess, or sometimes, I don't know, they'll just drink to it, I don't know. But people will actually feel the need to mark these moments because they're important transitions, important seasons. What we did apparently in our tradition is somehow use that, continue marking that, hey, spring, rebirth is beautiful. And look how, you know, the Passion story itself is about rebirth, isn't it? And Passover is about rebirth, it's about a new life in freedom, you know, out of Egypt. So we still work with those themes of the natural seasons. But then, of course, we add a lot in addition to that, and maybe even transform them so much that we forget the seasons. So let me point a couple of the markers of the Jewish calendar. For those who really care about ancient history, I do. I love ancient Middle East history and archaeology and all those things. So one of the interesting things is that the Jewish calendar, the way we use today, if you know Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year, it's somewhere around September. So our calendar is a calendar that begins in the fall. It goes to the next fall. But that calendar is not the original Hebrew calendar. That's a calendar that apparently we adopted as Hebrew people, Jews, from exile in Babylon. So that's a Babylonian calendar. And even some of the names of the months that sometimes even devout Jews say, oh yes, I want to keep the good Jewish calendar. And these are Babylonian names, right? This is very old. In the Bible, an older Hebrew calendar existed, but we, you know, it stopped being used, and probably because of what I'm mentioning. Because one of the interesting things is this, I totally understand spring when I have my fields. We can see the difference between early March and April. What happens if I live in Costa Rica, where it's eternal spring? What happens if I live in Babylon, where the weather is different, the rainy season, we don't care because we have the rivers. So it turns out that at some point early in our history as Jews, or maybe after centuries of the biblical cycles and calendar, suddenly Jews found themselves in another country, in another area with different weather patterns. And then they figure out, and not even with the land, many of these biblical holidays have to do not only with the land, but with thanking God for our land. Thank you, God, you took us out of Egypt and gave us a land where we can be free and live a good life. Well, how would I say that if I'm not in my land anymore? How would I say that if now I'm in exile, if I don't have anything? Oh, I have a problem. And how would I celebrate the spring and rebirth if, you know, weather there is different? We've been sunny for months already. So Jewish tradition, like it happened many times in the long history, was challenged because basic facts of life change. And you can't keep the same tradition, holiday celebration, symbols that were created for one reality and pretend that nothing happened. You know, it just doesn't work anymore. So one option was to give up and say, oh, all right, all holidays, let's move forward. And another option, which is what tradition really does, is tradition recycles and adapts and changes and grows, right? Like a person, like a tree, right? I'm not the same person that when I was 20. I am, but I'm not. Hopefully change and grow. So Jewish tradition then has done a lot of that. We have taken these holidays that were agricultural holidays, sometimes seasonal markers, and gradually turned them into something different. So an example is spring. We would be celebrating spring and the new season and everything is wonderful in the biblical time. And if you are somebody living from the land, lots of things begin to happen now. One thing is you soon begin to harvest the first grains, which is, thank God, because this is how you survive the whole year. So you will be worried about grains particularly, which is the first thing that grows. As you may know, Passover has a lot to do with grains. One of the reasons that in Passover, Jews do not eat bread, but eat matzah, the unleavened bread, is because that's made with grains. And basically what we're saying is, we take a break. Thank you, God, for all the grains of last year that sustained us through the winter. And now we start a new season with a new grain. Let's have a good one. So Jewish tradition did some transformation, which is, well, yeah, spring and the grains is great. But if you're not harvesting and if you did live in different weather, you need something different. I have something different for you. Remember the Exodus story? Remember the freedom from Egypt? Guess when it happened? It happened in the spring. And actually, the night of the Exodus, the Israelites that were living in Egypt, I can tell you exactly when it was. It was the 14th of the spring month. And I know because it was the full moon of spring. Oh, there you go. Now, I'm not saying that the Exodus didn't happen that day. What I'm saying is that if the Exodus happened 5 days later, it doesn't really matter. We want to celebrate and we want to mark this season. And we take this season. And now what I'm celebrating is not some grain, some harvest that somebody else does for me and I buy it at the supermarket. Now I have another compelling reason. Now it's my own history. Now it's a time of the rebirth of my people, right? So I celebrate that. This happens with several things. So I'll mention just to get a full view of the Jewish calendar. So in fact, the old Hebrew biblical calendar started with spring and started with Passover. It's fascinating because when you read in the Bible, you read Exodus 12, that this month shall be the first month of the year for you. This is God's words, right? Yeah, this is the first month. Yet it takes us 6 months later in the fall for us Jews to celebrate the new year. And we celebrate it because in the Torah we are told, on the 7th month of the year, on the first day, you shall celebrate blasting a shofar and the horn. We say, wait a minute, we celebrate New Year on the 7th month? What did I miss? And what we miss is that the new year now is following that Babylonian calendar. So it used to be the 7th and we kind of switch, right? At some point. So we keep inherited a little bit of both. So spring is what we have now, exactly 6 months after spring, right? This is the beauty of our seasons, right? From March 21st to September 21st. We have another equinox and all that, and we have fall. And in the land of Israel, particularly, spring and fall are markers not only of grow season and no grow season and cold and warm, but also of rain. I lived in Israel many years, and one of the beauties is that once Passover comes, you can put your umbrellas in a box and you will not use them. There will not be any rain probably until after Rosh Hashanah and the holiday of Sukkot, of the tabernacles, the booths, right? Which is, tabernacles and booths is what people take to go to the fields to do the final harvest of the year, right? And of course, we celebrate that day when? On the full moon of the first month in the fall, which is the beginning of the rainy season. And if you live in the Middle East back then, and even now, perhaps even more now, rain or no rain means life or death. Rain is still, water is such a commodity there in a desertic area where hopefully you get good rains in the winter and that carries you through the year. So these were important moments to mark. However, comes Sukkot, right? The tabernacles. Again, so you see many people, I used to do this, maybe I'll do it again this year. I build my own booth in the backyard and I put some, things that I harvested, right? So I buy some gourds and whatever it is. And it's kind of like we do here, right? Where you have a corn maze and it's, final harvest and we get pumpkins and things like that. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of recreating a farmer's end of harvest season, even though I'm not doing that, but I take something from it beyond the harvest. What I take is, God gave me these blessings this year. And perhaps there were many, perhaps there were few, perhaps I got what I needed, and perhaps I, got a little more. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I take a time now that the year ends and do two things. One is I'm thankful, right? Show appreciation for what I received. And the other, which is fascinating, the one holiday in the Bible where we have a special commandment. The commandment is to be joyful, to rejoice, right? You give commandments, do this, don't do that. This is a commandment, no, feel happy. I don't know how you can command that, right? But this is a commandment, you shall rejoice on this day. So what I'm doing is this, not only, it's an exercise in a little bit of humility and gratitude beyond the gift. Maybe this was not a great year, but you know what? I'm here, I'm doing well. Let's be happy with what we have, right? So as you see, what happens is what starts sometimes with a season, natural cycles, and then is related to agrarian life and what we do, suddenly is mixing with history. Oh, there's the Exodus, right? We came out and this is, and now it's national history. Now it's a holiday for the Jewish people. Everybody celebrates the spring. We celebrate the Exodus. That happened to us, right? And like Sukkot, then there is a value, there is a religious value and an ethical principle, right? Like the gratitude, the humility. Fascinating things of all these biblical holidays is that they all include specifically an important social component. Even from the biblical text, when people were taught, well, you go to the temple in Jerusalem and bring your offering and celebrate, it was essential, almost in every time that a holiday is mentioned, says, and you shall include in it the foreigner and the widow and the orphan and the poor, right? And you should make sure that you celebrate with everybody. It's not really a holiday of gratitude if I'm celebrating with an amazing dinner while the poor people are working for $7.50 in Walmart because they can't take that evening off, right? Our Bible doesn't like that kind of gratitude, which is gratitude for me and the rest of you, well, that's your problem, right? So we have that. And so this is how I see our Jewish holiday. I always think of three things, right? I think of nature, which is important and nice. And it's good to be aware of nature and the seasons. We're a little detached, but hey, we're still part of this nature. And then we have some story or some history in biblical story, the story of something that happened to the Jewish community maybe. But then we have also these ethical values, these principles that we try to enshrine. So how about I pause for a second because I've been talking for a while. You tell me what to do.
Oh man, I have a lot of questions, and the first thing that comes to mind, I often say this in our confirmation classes when we're going over the liturgical year, right? We're talking about these very same things. It's odd to be in a time and place where I can get bananas every day of the year.
Yes.
And how odd and strange that is in the long span of history to realize that that is just a very recent moment. And so I was thinking about that as you talked about sort of this connection to the seasons, the natural seasons of the world. And so I don't want to derail if you're going in a certain direction, but my question in this moment is, what does it mean to celebrate these holidays in a time where technology has maybe put this barrier between us and the natural seasons of the earth? How do you see that relationship? What's changing there, and should we grieve that? Is that something?
Yes. So, by the way, I'm old enough to remember when there were actually seasons. I remember that my mom will start bringing oranges and whatever it is because that's what we have now. And I say, I want an apple, and say, well, we gotta wait a few months. So I remember when we lived that way. Certainly we're not. And what I think this does to us is something interesting. I think that I tell you myself, and within Jewish tradition, I think many of us are not ready to give up on nature. We're not ready to give up the idea of seasons. We know that, well, maybe the bananas don't grow here, but they grow somewhere. Some farmer is collecting them. This comes from somewhere, and we should be aware. But you see what it does to us. If I'm the banana farmer, nobody has to tell me to be happy today. Nobody has to tell me that I have reason to celebrate. If I go and spend a week in my final harvest, nobody has to tell me why that day is important. With your confirmation class, what changed on September 24th or October 1st? It's the same supermarket, Harris Teeter. So now we have to tell people, and we have to somehow convince them that, you know what, it will be a good time to spend to this. So in some ways, and this is the challenge of Jewish tradition, we lost that obvious relevancy, right? So now I have to tell somebody, please remember that this is the harvest season, where it used to be that people were already doing the harvest, and all I have to tell them is, hey, how about say thanks to God for all this, right? So I think it is a challenge to how we keep our holidays. And I don't know what's going to happen, but definitely, if the Jewish tradition is any indication, as I said, Jewish tradition had the double challenge because of exile, because Jews after a few centuries, right, but eventually found themselves tied to a natural calendar and seasonal calendar and to a land, but now they live in a different place. Now Jews live in Germany, what is cold 10 months a year or something. And it's a different land. So what do? So Jewish tradition had a way of saying, well, nature is of course good and have it there, but what's a compelling reason for you, right? What's gonna get my people to get together now? Hey, we're in exile. Remember, once we were in a terrible place also called Egypt, and it was painful and it was suffering and it was not great. And guess what? It took a while, but we were led to freedom, right? So let's remember that. And let's remember that if it happens once, it can happen again. So now Passover became that holiday of hope. The whole Passover Seder, right? The whole celebration, which is a creation of the rabbis, because in the biblical Passover, it was very simple. You do this roasted goat, you eat bitter herbs, and that's pretty much it, right? Our rabbis, because we didn't have that temple, because everything changed, they had to literally create a celebration. So what we do now, that we sit and drink 4 cups of wine and say all kinds of things and sing and have symbols in food, rabbis have to create almost like a new reason, right, for us to celebrate and do that. So maybe that's what we need to do. We need to find new ways and new reasons for us to connect with nature, right? And make sure that young people understand the difference between a cell phone and something that grows, right?
Yeah, I think you're talking about, in a certain sense, the resiliency of these symbols, right? The ability to adjust and acclimate to a different setting. I think it's a part of the Abrahamic traditions to have this long history of adaptation. So I also loved how you sort of teased out sort of how the adoption of the Babylonian calendar had been a part of that, and that it had gotten incorporated. And it just makes me think of that syncretism that happens when religions learn in place and adapt. So I'm curious to see. I don't. This is maybe not a rule I set for myself, but I don't give myself to despair, because if these religions have been around for thousands of years, they've weathered a lot of storms. So whatever seems to be something that is, like, oh my God, we might be coming to the end here, literally, my God, what do we do?
Yes.
I think, oh, we've survived for thousands of years with these ambiguous symbols that adapt and help us observe the things about human meaning that are important.
What you said brings to mind a quote from a contemporary Israeli writer, not religious. He died a few years ago, but at one point, writing about religion, he said something like, there's 2 kinds of religions. There are the religions that are preserved exactly the way they were. We usually see them in museums, in a box. This is what it was. And then there's the religions that find ways of transforming themselves, of adapting, of changing. And those are the religions that are alive, right? And that sometimes goes against what we think tradition is. When I think tradition, I think, oh, I'm doing exactly what my great-grandfather used to do. And I think I learned that that's a completely wrong understanding of tradition. That's museum, that's preservation, that's formaldehyde. You keep things exactly the way they were. And when you do that, things tend to die. So tradition is not abandoning anything, but finding how you move it forward. What do I need to do with this that my great-grandfather was doing? So the way it makes sense to him, now it will make sense to me, and it will make sense to my kids. And an example, since Passover is coming, is the matzah, the unleavened bread, and which nicely now you can find it at the supermarkets already. The kosher corner. It started probably as a symbol of something. Why do we eat this? And the original symbol probably historically was the new grains, right? So all grain season, new grain season, let's do the basic, crushed grains and flour and water. Thank you, God. Eventually, in our Jewish tradition, what did we do? We did not abandon that symbol when we stopped caring about grains. We kept the symbol, but find a different symbolism. And now that is the bread of affliction. That is the poorest of breads that our ancestors ate in Egypt. When they left Egypt in Exodus, they had to leave and they have nothing, and all they had was this. So now I kept that same symbol, but instead of an agricultural symbol, now it's a historic symbol of an event that happened to us. And today, we go even beyond that. By the time the rabbis created our Passover celebration, what they say is, you know what that matzah is? That's the bread of affliction. So all who are hungry, come and join us. All who are in need, count with us. So now it became a symbol, not just of us and how we suffer back then, but a symbol of what it is to live in subsistence economy, right? What it is to live, and unbelievably to us maybe, but there's billions of people that definitely are not having for sure a dinner tonight, right? Or a lunch tomorrow, right? So, and we don't need to travel abroad to see food insecurity, right? So when it comes Passover, so look at all that we did. So I have that matzah, and at the same time that I'm thinking of, oh, ancient Israel, agriculture, the season. And then I'm thinking, oh, my own people, Exodus and suffering and freedom. And then I'm thinking, how about those people who are food insecure around us? How about people that are not meeting the basic needs? And I remember the main commandment, the phrase, almost like a refrain that repeats all through the Bible, whenever Passover is mentioned, and even beyond that, is, and you shall love the foreigner because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. And it's this idea of empathy. You went through difficulties, so don't just say, thank you, God, that I'm better, right? Remember that you were there because somebody else is in your shoes now, right?
No, it's it just makes me think of all the agrarian imagery in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, that subsistence farming was a way of life, that calls to mind that sense of, don't gather all the grain in your fields, leave some at the edges for the foreigner among you, to provide, right, in a sense. And that's not something that we, again, shifting out of an agrarian economy into an industrial capitalist kind of format, we aren't as familiar with those symbols, which made me think of, we're talking about the ambiguity of the symbols of these faith, right? Like the way I think of it is bread and wine. Those are the powerful symbols for the Eucharist, right? Like we break bread, drink wine together. They're elemental, right? They're like, this is food and this is drink, and they can be manipulated. This can be used for good or for evil. So even scripture text, right? City on a hill can be the longing of a dispersed people for a homeland, of people experiencing oppression. In another place, it can also be the same verse that colonizers use when they land in the continent of North America and use it for different needs. And the ambiguity of the symbols makes them resilient, but also liable to use and abuse. And I'm sitting with that complicatedness right now as we talk about this. So I guess my question is, how do you determine which changes are good and which are bad? How do we talk about this living tradition in a way of, oh, this is a good tradition we're talking about here. This is not such a great one.
Well, I can tell you one thing I learned because, and I have this in mind because this afternoon I'm going to be marking the season by going to Lowe's or Home Depot to the garden section, start working on my backyard like everybody else. Soon as we see that sun. And I'm thinking, well, there are different kinds of gardeners, aren't they? There are those who maybe go plant things and never touch it again. Well, there are those who understand, wait a minute, you need to prune a garden. And pruning is an interesting concept because you're cutting something. Oh, why would I cut this beautiful plant that is growing? Well, because if you leave it on its own, it's not going to do as good as or as well as if you actually do the cuts. Now, sometimes I feel bad, right? Oh, I cut a perfectly good branch, but I know that it's better. So I thought of this because in our tradition, well, there's a risk, there's a risk of adapting and changing and now starting talking about something new. Oh, am I losing something? Did I leave behind? Am I veering away from the original intent? I am not being faithful to the biblical writer who had this in mind. But the other risk is, well, I stay stuck in the Bible and I'm going to be in the museum for the next generation, right? So I find that there's risk in everything we do, right? And I think that that's when there are good gardeners and there are even better gardeners. How much pruning is too much pruning? How is too little? How do you adapt how you do this? And I think that that's the beauty in traditions. And that may be the reason why We have so many traditions within each one of our religions, right? We have Reform Jews or liberal Jews like me, and you have Orthodox. And the words Reform and Orthodox refer exactly to this. One is, let's preserve. That's Orthodox. Don't change anything because we need to preserve it as it is. It's a treasure. And the Reform says, well, that treasure is shriveling and it's getting dry and it's shrinking and it's dying. Because to preserve, if it's something that is alive, you have to feed it, you have to nourish it, and that has to somehow grow. Living things, you can put them in a box. Okay, and people say, oh, but there's risk, you change. And you say, well, how about the risk of not changing? I know what happens. I go to the museums, I see wonderful, great cultures, right? Greek and Roman and Egyptian and this and Babylonian. They're in great museums, right? We're alive.
Yeah, there's a power to that. You know, that change is just a necessary part of life. So how do you sort of move forward? And, you know, I guess in the Christian tradition, you could think of the same sort of labels, even though as I'm sure in the Jewish tradition, they're complicated, right? We have Orthodox, Catholic, we have Protestant, you know, but the Episcopal Church is technically a Protestant church, but there's a joke that, you know, do something twice in a service and it's tradition now, you know, like it's just become a part of how we do things here at St. Paul's. We've always done it this way. It's always been like that. And there's this way that we want to plant down, you know, to keep going with the agrarian sort of imagery. We want something to hang on to. And yet what I love about what you've described with the agrarian imagery is that planting down doesn't mean like being stuck in a museum. Planting down is allowing things to grow and develop and be trimmed and grow again and sort of move with the organic nature of it. That's a beautiful image to work with. That's the basis of our common calendar, you know.
You know, the rabbis who, you know, all the rabbis who are the ones that somehow, let's say, shape the liturgy and all things like that, or reshape it, right? They took from the biblical world, but that require Jewish calendar 2.0, right? A whole update to a new reality. And they always speak of two things, two important principles that are both important, but they are, you know, colliding with each other. And one is what they call what's constant, right? This is the beauty of tradition that we keep, and gives me a comfort that I go back to the same thing that I did last week. I go every Friday night and I say the same prayer that I said last Friday, that I say the Friday before, that I said 10 years ago, that my grandparents say. And it brings me a comfort, because if this was a bad week for me, I remember, you know, this very same prayer, I was saying it when it was great. And you know what? I was saying when it was very bad for me 4 years ago. And I remember how I felt. And look, I'm better, right? So there's a comfort to going back to a place that you know, where sometimes things change in ways that are very difficult for us. What a comfort it is to come to a place where everything is exactly what we want, that we're used to, that we feel at home, right? My old shoe. I love to wear my old shoe. It's the most comfortable. Knows exactly the shape of my foot. So that's important in a tradition. But what we noticed, and our rabbis noticed long ago, is that if you keep doing the same thing and same all the time, at one point that comfort, you know, makes you fall asleep, you know, makes you unengaged. And especially if you're a younger person, right? Young by definition is growth. I want new things. I don't want to always do the same thing that my dad did, right? So how to balance that with new intentionality? And that's the key, because sometimes in our religious traditions, I know, I've seen people, sometimes even I used to do this. I can By now, I memorize almost all the prayer book, right? Been doing this for 50 years. So I can literally recite a prayer while I'm thinking about the soccer match or the supermarket, or, oh, I need to take my car to the mechanic. I don't know how it happens, but my words keep coming like nothing, and my mind is in a completely different place. Right? So what do I gain by that? And when sometimes the risk of tradition is that we do things by rote and we sing this song and this, and because it's so familiar and so routine, it's not engaging our minds, you know, it's an autopilot somewhere. So sometimes you got to mix it up, right? You got to change. Today, we're not going to read this. We got a new reading. We have a different quote. We have a different song, or the same hymn, psalm, but with a different music or something. Oh, now you make me think. Now you make me re-engage. So to me, that's really the challenge, right? How you use tradition, how you keep the things that we want to go back to, and how you change. And whenever I change something in a service, I always have people saying, oh, but we didn't do this, or, you know, I missed that one. And whenever we don't, you know, I see people not reacting.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking of these high feasts that you just talked about, which have their correlates in the Christian tradition, right? Because we sort of pick up on the calendar that we sort of inherited from the Jewish tradition. But you know, Passover, Easter, Sukkot, it's all Hallows Eve. There's a relationship there, you know, and but I think of these high holy days as moments that we get to like sort of flip a switch, right? We're not doing the same Sunday in my tradition as usual. We get to try something new and we get to do something. So there's some elements in the calendar itself that help you change things up. But there is something else that you're naming here, which is our ability to adapt and change beyond those natural switches of the church year, right?
Yeah.
That you know, I talk about fasting and feasting. You know, Lent is a season of fasting to prepare for a season of feasting: Easter, joy, rebirth, resurrection, and acknowledging that both are a part of life. You know, but you're right. I mean, there is this need we have for something different, and yet, you know, even with we say a lot of things in what we call contemporary language in my tradition, using the prayer book that, you know, but there's a version that is more traditional that has all the these and thous of Old English text. And we don't do that at St. Paul's very often. You know, we don't use Rite One very often, but we do use the traditional language for the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's the only time I ever hear people use that language. And whenever we sort of think, should we use the contemporary language one?
It will not feel the same.
Oh, no, there's a lot of pushback there because we know this version, you know, it's comforting to have this version. And I think it's reasonable to have that reaction, but.
Yes, you know, in the Jewish world, in a congregation like mine, all the things that I was talking about apply, because I'm reading from Torah, I'm reading from scripture, I'm reading Hebrew, in Hebrew script. Who does this? I go to school, I go to Harris Theater, it's all English, an English alphabet, right? So you have a Jewish community that, unless you live in Israel, you're living in another reality, pretty much like the Babylonian and all the others. You live in that even the language, and even the language of prayer. So how different it is, the experience. Imagine this, how different it is if you sing or chant a beautiful psalm or song in Latin, and you're not a Latin speaker. And yeah, you may recognize a word here and there, right? And maybe you read a translation, right? But what you're saying is not you. You're just kind of preserving something ancient that is of value, but it's not your language. And how different it is if you say a song, I don't know, Imagine by John Lennon. Oh yeah, I understand every word. That's how I talk, right?
Right.
So in the Jewish tradition, we have this all the time because we have the Hebrew that most people don't really understand each word. It's not the language that they speak. And then you have your English. And what I'm thinking is, those who wrote the King James Bible for King James, they wrote it in contemporary language. Now, it is a 500-year-old for us, but they were not written in a 5-year-old, for them, it sounded that's the way they spoke, right? So how do we keep that? And I think it's the balance, right? Because I like ancient language and I like this preserve. I love the beauty of, look at the tree. I like the new growth, but I like to see those trees that are hundreds of years old, right?
Yeah.
So keeping both, right? That's the challenge.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that, I think that's a good spot to open it up to questions. I like the imagery that we've been playing with here. So just as a reminder to everyone listening, you can submit questions in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand and I can allow you to unmute yourself. Jane, would you like to speak up? I've seen your hand raised for a while. If you'd like to speak, please unmute yourself. And again, a reminder, raise your hand, submit a question, please do. Jane might have gone away for now since that hand was raised for a while. So any other questions or wonderments? Accidentally raised their hand. Thank you, Jane. So we have a comment, just a thank you note. This is great conversation. Much agreed.
Well, I can jump on one more thing then that I thought it was interesting. So as I was thinking of all this, suddenly, just before we started talking, I thought, oh, how about Hanukkah, right? So we're kind of more familiar with Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a completely different type of holiday in the Jewish tradition. And I think it shows other interesting dynamics happening because Hanukkah is not a biblical, right? Hanukkah is about the story that happened in the 2nd century BC. This is when the whole Bible already, the Jewish Bible, right? We call the Old Testament, that was already done. So this is the story of the Jewish community in Israel fighting an oppressor that was not just the typical conqueror, but it was the conqueror that wanted to impose their own culture and religion, right? And he's fighting for the right to stay true to who you are and not being forcibly converted into anything else, right? And that's Hanukkah. We celebrate, yeah, we won the battle and free the temple and miracle of lights, 8 days, and we light candles and we celebrate. What a coincidence, isn't it? That the one holiday where we light candles for 8 days happens to be exactly in December 21st. That is the darkest day of the year in nature. That is the day where we all do lights, right? And I would say that this is something for us to keep in mind, right? Even when we have Christmas and we have Hanukkah and there's lots of good reasons and history for why it's there. Let's think for a second. What a coincidence that of all the nights of the year is actually on the darkest days and the shortest days of the year that we have some celebration that involves lots of lights, right? So even that connects us all. And even that is something that, we can be detached from nature, but hey, last few days in December, they're dark, no matter what. We cannot change that. And this is why we all love to see the lights and this, and it's so important, right? And another interesting thing from the Jewish perspective is that Hanukkah, because it's not really a biblical holiday, it's been not such an important holiday. Many of the Jewish holidays, like Passover or Sukkot or Rosh Hashanah, whatever, have lots of ritual, and they're actually holy days, which means you take the day off, you don't go to work, right? You don't do any labor. Literally, it's a stay-home day. Hanukkah is not. Hanukkah is, yeah, you go to work and whatever, and we come back home, light the candles, say a blessing, move on, right? And that changed. And that changed now. Now Hanukkah is a big thing. And it is for one reason. It is because we now, for example, here as a Jewish community, live in a world where come December, actually come November, right? It's Christmas season. It's everywhere. I know and I hear 25 different Christmas seasons, whether I like it or not. Go to the mall, you hear him. Turn on the radio, you hear him. Hear a car commercial. I mean, it's everywhere, right? So as Jews, suddenly you're reminded, oh, wait a minute. And yeah, I see this holiday, but that's not what I celebrate. Oh, and I see my neighbors decking the halls and getting all the lights, and what I'm gonna do? Lit one little candle. You know what? I can do those lights too, and come and go and do. So we have, even Hanukkah is being transformed right now in front of our eyes. In this last generation or two, it's been transformed because of the environment in which we live. And as somebody said, no religion is an island, and definitely we see that. So we somehow adopt things from our neighbors doing the lights. Well, I do lights, but instead of maybe red and white, I'll make them blue or something. I try to find a way of make it my own in some way. So even this is happening before our own eyes, that we recreate and reshape based on where we are, right?
Yeah, that it's responsive and that it's constructive. Another image that some folks that are listening in might be familiar with, is I like to use, is the prayers in our prayer book are like a house. They're good bones. It's got all the, it's got windows, it's got nice molding, like everything is great, but like it doesn't become a home till you start inhabiting it and start using it and participating in it, and that's what that makes it really meaningful. And that investment in and of itself is also the process by which it changes, so it's not surprising, like you said, that we celebrate the birth of Jesus, the star shining over the city Bethlehem. We celebrate it on the darkest day of the year, right? Like we celebrate it around this time. It's because the Christian tradition kind of grew up in an amalgamation of cultures where that was an appropriate day to celebrate this feast of what we call God becoming flesh, taking human form, right? It's in the darkest night, that this hope is born, and that in and of itself is a part of it. So it's not just that, like, Christmas is influencing that. It's that pagan holidays influenced Christmas before that and created the space for us, and we're still observing these seasons. So there's a question, and maybe we'll close with this. The good thing is it helps us to realize others have traditions which we can and should respect as well. Would we have that as much without the commercialization? Would that be present without our current state?
Well, I can tell you, I don't enjoy that a car sales is a Christmas thing now. I think it devalues a little bit of what it is, and the commercialization, it's not the best thing. It's not the best thing. I recover the good side. Nothing is completely bad. So maybe the good side is that you have and I don't know, you may people here listening, I don't do this because it's not my tradition, but I notice many kids enjoy sitting in Santa's lap on the mall. And it's a beautiful tradition. Now, we know why Santa is there, because we want people to go to the mall. Okay. Otherwise, Santa will be somewhere else, right? But I think that, look, what is commercialization? For those kids that sit there, it's not. For them, it's a beautiful thing and it's a beautiful tradition. And I'm sure when they grow up, they will bring their kids to do it. So, we can be purists, right? And yeah, but we got to meet people where people are. And if people are in the mall, well, maybe it's not a bad idea that we somehow meet them there, with the balance. I think I find bad when Thanksgiving, which is a beautiful holiday, and to me it's one of the most meaningful. And it's just like Sukkot, it's the final harvest season, right? It's thanking God for what we have. And we say that, thank you, God, for what we have. And I gotta run because I gotta stand online all night so I can buy more stuff tomorrow. We really lose a little bit of the thanking for what I have, right? So commercialization is a double-edged sword, but there must be some good side to it too. Right?
Yeah, it's I think that's a lovely way to close this conversation, because I think you're naming the complicated nature of these holidays that are lived in real life, right? That are like bread and wine. They're the real stuff of life, and the religious and the secular, the sacred and the secular kind of meet in there. Commercialization and this meaningful moments, this meaning-making moments, kind of have to meet in the middle somewhere, and it's not like we get to choose, but we do get to choose how to observe it. How do we participate in it? So thanks again for being with us this morning, for the opportunity to gather together. Always enjoy talking to you, as you well know, and I'm so glad we get to do this. Just a note for folks attending, I am putting in the chat a note, a post about last week's presentation involving the history of the Black churches in our diocese. You can find a couple documents there about what the Reverend Kathy Walker mentioned last week that gives you a little bit more background into that. And this is the last of our Lenten series. Next Sunday is Palm Sunday. We head into Holy Week. I thank you for being with us in this time. And let's observe, a holy week as we head into Easter, hope, and resurrection. And thank you again, Rabbi Ariel, for being with us.
Thank you. A pleasure. Hope to be doing this in person soon, and have a very good holidays, everyone.
Thank you. You too. All right. Take care.